inviting Professor Sachs to join us in the scenario, and I will leave him my seat to guide the discussion part.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me join a little bit late because we're running back and forth between venues. And I know that the three presentations are outstanding. The point I would like to emphasize following John's presentation right now is that we have lots of tools that should be deployed in public policy to bring about the transformation. What is the goal? A question that was raised in your presentation. I think the goal has to be net zero by 2050. The goal has to be to make this work consistency with the Paris Agreement. If we don't hold to that, we're lost. And we do understand, I think, from the IPCC in particular, but that reflects a very large body of thought that we're already in an extreme danger zone. The 1.5 degrees is not safe, but it is agreed, and so it is a kind of foothold for relative safety. If we move beyond 1.5 degrees, we're moving increasingly into two profound dangers. One is a breakdown of any globally agreed norm. And second is the positive feedbacks of the physical systems that could lead to runaway disaster. So the 1.5 degrees, I believe, is crucial both for its climatology and its global politics. We do not have political processes that match that goal, neither in the outcome, certainly, because we know that the world as a whole is on a trajectory to at least 3 degrees Celsius warming and perhaps even higher, but also in the mechanics of government itself. Governments are incremental, they're short-term, they are the vector sum of lobbying interests and political pressures. They are not organized, rational, long-term problem-solving processes in general. So politics is very messy and is very poorly attuned to this particular challenge. So part of the problem of this integration is to invent a new kind of political process. It's not unheard of course, that we take certain parts of our politics relatively outside the electoral cycle. This was one of the innovations in monetary policy, for example, after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, that central banks should become independent. We need a quasi-independence of energy authorities in our countries that are directed towards a long-term climate goal. This won't be achieved by day-to-day electoral politics. This will be achieved by a national strategy carried out over several decades. The one precedent that we have of a successful, well, we have a few precedents, I should say, of successful environmental actions that we should learn from. Probably the most important global achievement has been the ozone depletion solution of the Montreal Protocol, which involved the substitution of the CFCs by HFCs. Not a perfect solution, because HFCs introduced a new greenhouse gas, but at a modest cost compared to the dire dangers of CFCs. When you look at the policy framework for the CFC elimination under the Montreal Protocol, it was a command and control substitution. the CFCs were phased out by quantity control everywhere. It was easier. This was just refrigerants and a few other industrial uses of a set of compounds. And it was a case where the main producers of the CFCs became the main producers of the alternative. And so the vested interests went away as soon as DuPont realized that it had a better alternative and then defended the elimination of the CFCs. But the point from a policy point of view is we did not have a CFC tax. We did not have a CFC emissions trading system. We knew that it was dangerous, that it needed to be phased out, and within a short period of time it was phased out. I think what John showed on the list of instruments is extremely important. It is only because economists got to this first that carbon pricing or the emissions trading system became the main instrument that was talked about. Prices play an important role in an economy, but regulation plays at least an equally important role. And so we need both dimensions of policy making. There are a range of price instruments from permits that are traded to carbon taxation, to feed-in tariffs, to reverse auctions for supply of commodities, all of which are a kind of pricing system. And then there are regulations which mandate that utilities must decarbonize the mix of their power generation by a certain date. Success will require both kinds of instruments. Surely the automobile manufacturers will not succeed simply by consumers making a choice to go to electric vehicles. The supply chains are too complex for batteries, for production, the retooling of tens of billions of dollars minimum. It's actually hundreds of billions of dollars to shift from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles is a major industrial policy that requires a lot of regulatory control, complementary infrastructure of charging facilities, regulations about how the electricity grid is going to be managed with a large fleet of electric vehicles, the good idea of highway-based catenary lines for electrification of heavy freight and so forth. So this again is a set of tools quite different from simply a price or raising gasoline charges and so forth. Those could play some role, but they're a limited role. What I see at this meeting in many governments is that for the first time, governments are looking at this question of what it means to reach zero. They're doing what we're doing at this conference, which is that they're looking across all the sectors. They're understanding this is about power generation, this is about transport, this is about buildings, this is about industry, it's about ports, it's about shipping, it's about aviation. Most governments know very little about most of those technologies because they buy their automobiles, they buy their trucks, they lease their planes, they are not shipbuilders and probably not shipping managers and so forth. So many of those boxes are beyond any individual government. Every government, though, has to be an expert in power generation and utilities because every country produces most of its electricity, in fact. And so that's the one area where there is some understanding. And then countries are asking the question, what's really going to happen on transport? What kind of cars are we going to be driving or buying in 5 or 10 or 15 years? They don't know very clearly. So they don't quite know how to invest, how to prepare, how to make their grid work together with that. Airports, they're not thinking about because there are only two producers of large civilian aviation right now, Airbus and Boeing. They'll probably be a Chinese producer by 2030, but not before then. And in this sense, they're just users of these technologies. When these governments are now looking, they're realizing that the policy framework is more complicated, that they're not ready. They're also realizing that they can't solve these problems within their national boundaries, that almost everything, including power, is transmitted across national boundaries and involves regional networks and building regional grids. That's another major complicating factor. Governments do not have access to the best engineering necessarily. It's not the habit of governments to even understand the difference of science and engineering. In fact, and there's a lot of confusion in the public, do you listen to the climatologists or do you listen to the engineers? Actually, the climatologists know very little about the engineering, and the engineers don't need to know that much about the climatology, but they do need to be given the time horizon of what is necessary in terms of the carbon specifications. So I believe that we're in a new kind of problem solving that requires first the decision to study the problem of how to get to zero. Second, that for each country that understands what's under their control, what is part of a regional decision making, and what requires global solutions in order for countries to be able to implement their own solutions. And then third, to understand what kind of policy framework will be needed for any kind of technological framework ahead. And this is where I would like LESC to continue to intensify its actions. I believe that we're really in front of us at a very important year. I would like everybody to ensure that their own government or their own country has a pathway to zero by 2050 as a baseline within the next 6 months, because the only chance to have, and really within the next 3 to 6 months, the only chance to have nationally determined contributions presented in Glasgow next November that are compatible with the world we want is if everything is dramatically accelerated now. So our discussion needs to become the discussion of every government, and we should be thinking about how to absolutely make that the norm, and how even to explain that this is what needs to be done. We don't have the luxury of an academic 10 years of getting this in place. This has to be the reality now. One point that I saw as a point of connection for us and policy is that the finance ministers, about 70 or 80 of them now, have come together as a coalition of finance ministers for action. This is very, very important because the finance ministers are the most important single member of a cabinet for domestic policy making, period, on almost any subject. And they have agreed to what they call the Santiago Principles of Action. And the main Santiago Principle of Action is a toolkit for finance ministers of what to do. So I would like us, LESC, to combine with the finance ministers to help make that toolkit so that there's an actual planning process quickly underway across governments of the world to understand this is really the homework assignment of the next 6 months. Get your best engineers, get the best help, fill in this page. Where's your power going to come from? What are your assumptions on vehicles? What are your assumptions on buildings, new buildings and retrofitting buildings? What are your worst industrial nightmares in CO2 emissions, whether it's petrochemicals, steel? cement or other sectors, and what are your approaches for those sectors, if any, so that you can see, as finance minister and in a cabinet, what is the real state of affairs and how could you make a proposal to get to zero. So that's how I see our work evolving and how we make this integrated effort. All I can ask us is that we speed up because we're really physically at the end of the 1.5 degree story. It's either now or forget it. It's basically forget it, except that it's too dangerous to just say that. We have a year, I believe, to see whether the world could ignore Trump, ignore the confusion, ignore the domestic interests, and actually understand what this is about. And that will require that we leave here with a full homework assignment that's quite urgent, and that we understand that that checklist is technological pathways combined with policy framework that brings the lawyers, the economists, the financiers together in a rich package of measures, and that encourages regional solutions, for example, European-wide or Mercosur-wide or GCC or ASEAN-wide measures as crucial for success. So those are my observations on the three excellent presentations, and I would invite any of the panelists to make some remarks and open it up for discussion generally among all of us.
Thank you. Well, I think, I said most of what I wanted to say here in the presentation. I think next year really is the key year, as Professor Sachs has said. It's essential that all countries feel confident of coming with more ambitious actions. So I think, as I mentioned in detail, the work we're doing on getting to net zero emissions in Latin America and the Caribbean provides a tool for decision makers, particularly ministries of finance and planning, to be able to develop the short and medium term levels of ambition that are consistent with getting to net zero in a way that is socially inclusive and can bring the potential economic benefits that are there. We need to move away from traditional methods of cost-benefit analysis. We need to think way beyond just looking at carbon as an externality or not, and really think about the whole range of possible benefits that can come with that transition, including creation of jobs, net creation of jobs, as our work in Chile has shown with phase out of coal, the potential for creating net jobs, but recognizing the need to target support to those communities that may lose out or will probably lose out in the absence of a concerted, deliberate effort by governments to enable that. I think also what I've been really impressed about at the COP here this last week is the strong focus on nature-based solutions, because they bring so many benefits in terms of carbon, yes, but in terms of resilience as well. And we must not forget, as Jeff said, we're currently headed towards 3 degrees. We have to focus on getting to net zero with any chance of reaching or staying below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. But from a risk management perspective, we have to also think about building in resilience for probably 3 degrees, potentially even more, building an adaptive capacity of countries in all sectors, and building adaptive management approaches to allow countries to be able to build in resiliency over time as well. So I probably won't say any more, because it'd be great to get some questions and hear views of the audience.
Just a quick observation. The legal tools that are in our book are, of course, US tools, but there's no particular reason why any country couldn't use the list of tools as a starting point or a checklist for developing its own list of, or expanded list of options for the for the 2020 project. One of the things that we did in the book was we created an index of recommendations by actor so that you don't have to read through the whole book to find recommendations that might be applicable to, say, to national legislatures or to local governments or whatever, because there's literally a 100-page index of recommendations by actor in the back of the book. And so if you're in a particular place where you are wondering what your choices are, the book might help you figure it out.
And I guess the final point that I would add is just to build on what I was saying earlier about the importance of engaging developing economies. You know, I think the 1.5 degrees report really does create quite a different picture of the climate trajectory for those countries. And certainly in Southeast Asia, what we see is that most of those major economies, their NDCs represent a reduction on absolute emissions, a reduction on growth in emissions rather than a reduction on absolute emissions. And it's unlikely that NDCs will be significantly increased, in 2020. So if emissions are still going up in 2030, if they're not yet clear on when they're going to peak emissions and turn them around, that represents a real challenge for us globally in terms of solving climate change. And just to reiterate, I mean, these are countries that are often still faced with, large proportions of the population who are living in poverty and who have, limited access to energy, for example. So they are complex challenges that they're trying to deal with at the same time as solving climate change, and they're also usually quite significantly affected by the impacts of climate change as well. So figuring out, how to support those countries to really think through quite a significant paradigm shift is critical to solving climate change. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's one that we really need to grapple with, I think, a lot more deeply.
I think we should open it up for discussion. Please, I don't know who has a mic, and I'm told completely ridiculously, I have to leave because I'm speaking in the Spanish Congress in a moment. So I will run out again, and you will moderate.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Roger Dargawal from Monash University. A question for the whole panel is, and the title of this system, or this conference is Transitional Change. And from a systems approach, do we have the system of systems in place where the climate scientists tell the engineers what has to happen, the engineers tell the lawmakers what the laws need to be, the economists work out how much it's going to cost, and then go back to the engineers and say, well, can you do it cheaper? And the engineers go back to the climate scientists and say, well, what happens if we do it this way? And do we have all these lines of communication open so that we're moving between the different sectors efficiently and we'll actually arrive at where we need to get to before it's too late?
Amali, do you want to go first if you've got to leave?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously one of the key problems I think we face is that we don't tend to work well across silos, and that's definitely the case inside government as well as across different disciplines. We do need to be able to find the ways to get across that. I mean, I do think, and this is what we're doing, Costa Rica, Colombia, other countries now, is that creating that long-term vision and bringing all the key players together around that can be, and really building an ongoing, continuous dialogue, real dialogue with citizens engaging on what that future may be, consumers, what do they really want, infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure is needed, what kind of city do you want to live in? I think, having that long-term vision, but then ensuring there is this very multidisciplinary, deep, multi-stakeholder dialogue is the way to, it's essential. We see what's happening in many countries of the world, certainly in our region, the issues around inequality rising up the agenda. Actually, I think, making that transition provides huge opportunities for bringing a much more inclusive society that really is built around strong foundations of citizen engagement and dialogue. It has to be. We have no option.
I wanted to add a word about this. That structure that you described does not exist. that structure that you described does not exist almost anywhere. It is the rational, social level problem-solving method. That's what we're trying to put in place. Our government structures are not geared towards that. Our politicians are often directly antagonistic to that, but are certainly not trained in that kind of serious problem solving. So part of what we're doing is trying to simulate that by civil society, meaning academia, which has a professional stake in this kind of approach, doing some of that convening, by business leaders doing some of that convening, by leadership organizations like FEAM doing some of that leading, and then trying to sell that approach to government to say, you will not succeed without this kind of intensive interchange. I think that the public participation is crucial, but unless it's also steered by expertise, it fails. Because an open discussion that is not guided by expert knowledge will also not converge and not succeed. And there's a big battle about that. Who are the experts? And how do they find their voice, and who pays to do that? And of course, there is a deliberate attempt to undermine all of that by interest groups, by the Murdoch, coal, hydrocarbons sector of the English-speaking world, for example. So this is really the battle. But my own thinking about this, just to put it this way, is I think of it in a crude sense, obviously being a little bit silly about it, is what I would assign to graduate students: solve this problem. And they would set up a kind of optimizing framework. They would do some kind of nonlinear optimization. They would describe the logic of it. If it was an economics class, they would define the policy support of that, whether it's taxes, regulation, or something else, or public investment. That's the rational process where you have a maximand, you have a set of constraints, and you optimize. And then you look at the actual policy making in the world, and it looks nothing like that. And part of the idea is to bring the actual policy making on this complex question into coherence with what a rational process would be. And to do that not as a fun game, but in real time. And we've run out of time, basically. We're in the last year of this, so all ideas about how to intensify this in the coming months is crucial right now, really. This is exactly the idea, and we need to replicate it across countries everywhere.
Perhaps we should see, how much time do we have left for questions?
So maybe we can take another question from the public.
I will try to extend the questions. I would ask for Ms. Amal, but if somebody can help me, I would appreciate that. So everybody has showed us a path to reach net zero emissions, but having that in mind, I would like to ask if the Inter-American Development Bank and local governments, or everybody in the world, have came up with a specific target for each country, from Latin America, Brazil, Caribbean, Europe, I don't know, to achieve the net zero emissions. For instance, Scottish Power, that it's a subsidiary from the Iberdrola that was here in this morning in United Kingdom, specified that in order to achieve the net zero in 2050 in UK, would be necessary to install 4,000 heat pumps and charging points every day from today until 2050. So I'd like to ask if we are working with these specific targets to in each country?
I mainly have to leave, and I think Carlos Salle, who is from Universidad, is also here, but I don't know if maybe Meg or John would like to say a word on that, or?
I'm not quite sure that I understood the question, but I can give you some examples from Australia, actually, that might be quite interesting. So Australia was also part of the Deep Decarbonisation Pathways project in 2014. So, and Climate Works led that work in partnership with the Australian National University and the CSIRO, which is our National Science Lab. And so we mapped out technology by technology, how you get to net zero emissions in Australia. So we know how to do it, and that has informed policy at the national level, although not a clear target or, a government-endorsed trajectory. However, so we have, I think, a national government that's not overly supportive of strong climate action. But what we do see is at the subnational level that approach is really taking hold. So we've also worked with a number of subnational governments in Australia, and I think we may be in quite a unique position in being a country that has 8 out of 8 subnational governments who've all set a net zero by 2050 target. And are in various stages of implementing them. So some now have legislation in place and very clear sectoral targets focused on achieving that. And other states, it's more a sort of a lofty goal at this stage. But yeah, so it's, I mean, in the case of Australia, certainly we understand how to get there. The process of embedding it in the, the regulations and policies to ensure that it actually gets implemented is a work in progress.
Well, just one other thing I would say about goals is that it helps a lot if you have agreement across the entire jurisdiction about the achievement of those goals. In the United States, you get that in some states. New York State, for example, just adopted a very aggressive goal. And to sort of go back to the prior question, if you've got goals and all sectors are pretty much agreed on a goal, then you can establish some kind of a process for figuring out how to get there. But if the prior question is, if you don't have that kind of agreement, it's really hard to do this. And so, for example, in the United States, a lot of us say, well, gee, we went from almost nothing in terms of preparation for World War II in a very short period of time to being ready to fight and win that war. But we did that because we were unified. And in the United States, we are not now unified.
I'm not sure if we have the time because we are a little bit out of the timing, so maybe we are going to close the panel here. I will ask you to give a round of applause to our speakers, and let's go for the final closing of the conference. Well, so this is the end of the conference, the final closing. We had yesterday a very interesting session with 2 settings in keynotes, and in fact 2 sessions with several keynotes, and then 4 roundtables on technologies. And today we have 2 additional roundtables on the metrics and the systems transformation, the systems coupling we need. For the first table, I got a lot of notes, like yesterday with Fernando, so I had the time to prepare a little bit to do a summary on that. For the second one, because of my multitasking today, I wasn't so fast in taking my notes because I didn't want to distract here in the scenario. So probably I will be less exhaustive, but I think I got at least a few key points, a few learnings that we can take. So for the first table on metrics are so important in sustainability. These are the means that leads us to an end, as it was said in the table. So Perrine started to presenting that there is a proliferating methodologies and different frameworks for measuring sustainability, but I think she made a very good point when she focused their sustainability reporting in 4 points. The product, what are companies delivering? This has to be aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, not only because of carbon, but also because of the kind of product you are delivering. Second, the process, how these products are developed and brought to us. Third, the responsibility on the supply chain, not only the carbon, on the scope 3 carbon emissions, but also on how companies lead the supply chains and take the true cost, not only environmental, but social of those supply chains. And finally, being a good citizen, the corporate citizenship. And this means contributing to good policy making, to good legislation, and also contributing to the welfare of our societies by tax paying. So I think these 4 points with 2 additional points at the end were very powerful, and I'm really looking forward to read the report because I think it's going to be very useful. Then Suzanne presented how MIT is working on this carbon emissions framework and well, how this is applied for the freight industry in particular. And focusing on the scope 3, we discovered that we have to look also at the carbon in the fuels, inside the fuels, and not only during the use phase. So this is also an important insight that I bring for my classes and my teaching, and that needs to be incorporated. Here at the school, we are also very conscious about the scope 3 metrics. We are trying to make an effort to calculate our scope 3 carbon footprint as an institution, including the business travels and so on. And well, we think that's an important issue to be considered. But this is even more important in the goods industries and the supply chains. Also, we saw the mining emissions. The mining emissions, so that's the complexity of taking all these emissions into account. But I can link that with Mark's speech later on, and because he complemented this vision, saying that the means are not the ends. So we already have powerful insights. Then, even if we don't have perfect bulletproof data of scope 3 with all the emissions considered, we already can have a very good approximation taking into account qualitative insights as the deflationary and inflationary economies of the different energies. And I bring also this insight to my classes probably, because it's something that we have, when we explain sustainability to our engineering students, they are very analytical, they want to have perfect information, and I think this kind of narratives help us to transmit that we already have a good sense of what is behind that. So I am also learning a lot with the conference and trying to apply that later on. I also like a lot this idea of customers asking asset managers, what is the implied temperature of your portfolio of assets? This is a very powerful tool. I will complement that with what is the social the social impact of your portfolio of assets. But if we consider all these insights in these very simple questions, this is a powerful tool that can be used as well. Carlos, later on, he presented the trajectory of Iberdrola, which is a power utility that had done a long decarbonization pathway. And what I learned there is that for them, 20 years ago, the Kyoto Protocol was a megatrend to observe, and that helped them to build their strategy, and that has given the current results. No? So I also got from that if you don't move into the green or the decarbonization trend right now, you probably will be out of the market in a few years. So, well, companies need to be constantly looking at the strategy, how the society evolves together with them, so that they can adapt transform as they need. And finally, Matthew presented this recognition tool from the Global Climate Action Portal, which has to transition from a recognition tool to a monitor progress or tracking tool that enables businesses, cities, and also regions, not only the nations that are here at COP, but also these, as he said, non-party stakeholders, to track their progress and how, not only declaring commitments, but also taking action. So that was a summary of the first table. Yeah, and for the second one, it's much shorter. So, but what I got there, presented a lot of challenges and several ways we have to decarbonize. We already have a lot of discussion on that yet, but I like very much the narratives he presented that we need radical transformation. and radical transformation is not about building a small house and then building a skyscraper. It's about building now the fundamentals or the foundings of this new economy we need. So, well, that's the big challenge that will appear later on in the discussion. How we create these new foundations is not so clear. We need a lot of, it's an integrated effort. We need to put several actors together, to talk together. That means engineering, politics, economics, lawyers, everybody in society, with a concerted effort to bring these new technologies and this new governance framework that we need. So this is part of the panel. Megan also was talking about the opportunities of the green economy. And this has to do also with something that was commented yesterday, which are the narratives. So we need to change the mindsets. And in order to change the mindsets, maybe we need to approach each stakeholders with what is important. So with something which is very important, for instance, is creating jobs. So the green economy is also creating jobs. And probably the brown infrastructure is not so well positioned right now to do that. So that's also some levers that we can use for building our discourse here. Also the creation of resilience, it's something that arose in the last table. So it's another argument that we can use. Finally, John, he also presented several legal tools for decarbonization. And what I learned there, among all the things he presented, is that it's not always about creating new legal tools, but also looking at what is already there and checking if it's adapted to the current situation. So maybe there are some legal tools that come from the previous states, and now they have to be removed and to leave a space to the new legal tools. So the goal is zero emissions by 2050. We need an integrated effort, and we need the 3 E's that appeared yesterday: ethics, economics, engineering, of course, and also the concerted effort of all society to take us to this goal. Let me finish with a little bit of acknowledgements to the people that work very hard to make this possible in 3 weeks, because we got to know that the conference was being held here in at the beginning of November. So it was a big effort by a lot of people, and I would like to acknowledge them. So I want to thank our partners of SDSN and also the Spanish chapter of SDSN Reds, because they chose us to hold here the conference, and we are very grateful for that. It was a great opportunity for the school and also for the students to have all these discussions here. So we really like to work with you, and we loved it. I also want to remind of the organizing team, ITD UPM, the Research Center on Technology and Innovation for Human Development at this university. Jaime, Jose, and Andrea, they did a great job arranging a lot of things, communication, the volunteers, the program, and so on. So thank you to them. Also to Carlos, my colleague at the department, who is leading that center. And also, I would like to mention Luismi and Jose Luis Álvaro, an administrator of the school, that have worked very, very hard to bring a conference in a bank holiday yesterday and have everything opened and with the heating and with the services available for us. So thank you to all these people. And finally, let me have a big applause for our volunteers. We were super excited to see the great response our students gave to the call we did for this conference. We had a group of 35 students coming here to the school in a holiday to organize all this, and I would like to finish this acknowledgement applauding them. Okay, and just a final plea for closing the conference. Well, we took a lot of learnings in this 1 day and a half. I hope you can apply them in your professional and personal lives, in your policy making, in your teaching, in your research, whatever. And if we want to keep our temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius in 2050, if we want to have prosperous and thriving societies where nobody is left behind, we need systemic transformation. Let's be the change we want to see. Thank you.